Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Welcome back to another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. As you know, there's been a lot of controversy post-pandemic between companies and employees about returning to the physical workplace. My guest today is uniquely qualified to discuss this topic, and I'm very pleased to welcome back for a second appearance, Wayne Turmel. Wayne, I'm so glad to see you.
Well, thank you for having me back. That's not a universal sentiment, so I'll take it.
Well, we had a delightful conversation, and for my listeners that might want to go back, that was episode 77. And at the time that we're recording this, we're closing in on 300. So that's been quite a while back. In fact, it was in the fall of 2020 when we were dealing with those early months of COVID, and most people were working remotely at that time. And in that conversation, we talked about the book that you and your co-author, Kevin Eikenberry, had released pre-COVID called The Long Distance Leader. And you focused on leading remote teams. And so you were actually ahead of your time with that book, because who could have predicted COVID?
Well, nobody predicted COVID, but to be fair, I've been standing on that street corner for about 18 years. Before the brain finally caught up with me.
That's such a good point. Often people think when something happened like COVID that the idea of remote teams is something new that we had to adapt to. But you're right. They were in place for a good while before that, but not universally like they became. And so recently, they have released a second edition of The Long Distance Leader, and it has this subtitle: Revised Rules for Remarkable Remote and Hybrid Leadership. And so today, I really am very interested in exploring with you, Wayne, the things that you and Kevin were seeing in those years between your first book and your second book that caused you to say, we need to add some material here because things are not the same as they were back when we first released it. So before we jump into that, though, give my listeners a little bit more of a perspective about your work over the last however many years you want to share in leadership and remote leadership in particular.
Sure. Well, I've been in the training and development space for 28 years now, primarily in communication and presentation skills. And for about the last 18 years, I have been really focused on remote work, communication at a distance, that kind of thing. And then 10 years ago, Kevin Eikenberry merged my company into his. And in 2018, we came out with The Long Distance Leader, which was a compilation of work that we had already been doing at that stage and what we had learned. And we came out almost exactly 2 years to the day before COVID pushed everybody across the Rubicon. So we were kind of uniquely positioned to help with that. And, was very blessed and happy to help a lot of people through that particular crisis. And now it's 6 years later. And the world has kind of shifted in some ways and not so much in others. But the book needed to be updated, and really in two important ways. One is just the technology has changed. When we wrote the book, Zoom was literally not a thing. And it went from this free service that nobody really used to a verb to a syndrome in like 18 months. Microsoft Teams did not exist. There was Skype for Business, which was a similar tool, but nothing like Teams is now. And while we try to avoid being too specific about technology in the book, we talk about email, we don't say Outlook versus Gmail versus whatever. That did need to be addressed. The second thing that I think was really important was, as much as remote work was growing, we were talking about, hey, this is what you're going to experience. You're going to want to do this and that. Well, now pretty much anybody that could work remotely has done so, at least part-time, and it's no longer this mysterious thing. And so we're past the try this and see how it feels stage, and now we're at the let's make it work stage. The other subpart to that is, it's not like everybody said, okay, back to the office, we're going to pretend that never happened. Some companies did, but the genie's out of the bottle. And so something like 80% of American companies now claim they have hybrid work, which is some form of flexibility about who works where. And there's all kinds of confusion and disagreement about what that means. And so try to help leaders get their mitts around what's new in the not entirely remote, but certainly not back to the before times world that we're working in.
Just so we're all kind of going from the same page, how do you define hybrid?
Differently than about 80% of other people. Most of what we call hybrid work before COVID, there was talk about blended work and various and sundry ways to smush it together. And coming back, a lot of people call it hybrid work. Well, we've got people in the office 3 days a week. Or some people are back in the office full time and some are working remote. And that's a blend, it's a mix. But for most people, it's not a strategic decision. It's a hostage negotiation. And what I mean by that is, it's kind of like the employers went, how much can we make them come back to the office before they quit on us? And the employees were like, how much can we whine about having to go back until they fire us? And so we've kind of settled on 3 days a week, and we're going to make it work. And it kind of works. Nobody's 100% happy, or very few people are 100% happy with the arrangement, but it works well enough and we're kind of functioning. But that doesn't mean it's strategic. True hybrid work is not just who works where, but it introduces the concept of time. So it's who works where and when. And it asks a lot more questions about what work needs to be done synchronously and what work needs to be done asynchronously. And does it matter if we're all logged on at the same time in the morning and logged off at the same time at night? It takes a much more strategic approach. And I think if you look at the word hybrid, it should tell you that. In biological terms, whether it's an apple or an animal or whatever it is, right? A hybrid is two separate things that create a third entity. And that third entity is its own thing. I mean, a Gala and a Crisp create a galactic crisp apple, which is its own thing, right? The most common example that kind of makes sense is, if you think about mules, yes, they're part horse and they're part donkey. But as an old farm boy, I can tell you that mules are mules, and they are not horses, and they are not donkeys. They are freaking mules. And no matter how many mules you create, all mules are more alike than different from each other. And that's what a hybrid truly is. And so in hybrid work, it's not just who works where, but it's a new way of thinking about the work in a much more strategic fashion.
Mhm.
Did that help at all?
Yes, it's really helpful because I think this whole area of time and when is really critical. As I was listening to you, I was thinking about how many paradigms got broken, you know,
More,
with this.
to be fair, I mean, talk about paradigms being broken, and my skin breaks out in a rash every time I use the word paradigm. But we are going through maybe the most seismic, it's a little more slow motion, but maybe the more seismic change than we've gone through since the 1920s and 30s. In the 1920s and 30s, we were going from a rural economy to an urban economy. The automobile got introduced, and more importantly, what it meant to have a job was different. Uh, the introduction of the 40-hour work week, the introduction of the 8-hour day, uh, those types of things, which we now consider the norms. I mean, the idea of going to an office, being there for 8 hours and leaving is about 100 years old, maybe a little more if you live in London or New York. But it became our paradigm, there's that word, for what it meant to work.
Mhm.
And we're now going through a change where what does it mean to go to work if you don't go anywhere? And do I need to work in a big office with a bunch of other people? And do companies need big offices? There's so much that's being changed. The idea that work, a lot of work, not all work. And we in the business blogosphere tend to say things like, well, everybody worked from home during the pandemic. No, it was a third of the workforce. It was just everybody we knew. You know, 2/3 of the workforce still had to flip burgers, run drive-throughs, put stuff on trucks. Uh, but a third of the workforce is nothing to sneeze at, especially when it's the third of the workforce that makes up the managers and the well-paying jobs.
So, with this major shift, and the need to be strategic, how do you help people make that shift to asynchronous work as opposed to everybody's got to be here at the same time doing the same things
Yeah.
and getting them, I think getting everybody, both the leaders and the employees, to think differently about what does it mean to be at work.
Well, you can have all the model, and we've got models up the wazoo in the book, and all the thinking and the blog posts and thought leadership and all that. None of it matters until the client has a problem. And when they have a problem, you can say, aha, so let's address this problem. So I'll give you a perfect example. We had people come into the office and we want them in 3 days a week, and that's kind of sort of working. And I go, okay, what works and what doesn't? They said, well, people get together and most of them are happy to see each other. And the boss is off my back because he's not paying for space nobody's using. And it kind of works. But when you drill down and say what's not working, they'll say things like, on the 3 days I go to the office, I can't get any work done. People are talking to me. They're sticking their head over my cube like a meerkat, interrupting me. There's cake in the break room, so we got to go do Alice's birthday, and I'm not getting my work done. And then on the days when they're home, they go, I'm not getting my work done because I'm on Zoom calls from morning till night. Well, what if we took a look at the work that needed to be done and we said, the work of collaboration and brainstorming and team building and those sorts of things and interacting with other parts of the organization, it makes sense to do that when we're in the office. I'm probably not going to get the tasks accomplished in the office that I get done when I'm at home. But if I do the talking and the brainstorming and the thinking and the meeting when I'm in the office, I don't have to be on Zoom calls from morning till night because we're being smarter about what work gets done where and when that work gets done. Does it make sense that we all log on at the same time in the morning, regardless of whether we're in the office or not, and our day ends at the same time? And if we're not logged on, clearly we're not working and we don't care, and we're, spending all our time at Target or whatever paranoid delusions the manager thinks. Or there are certain times when I got to be there for a meeting or I want to be available to my teammates. But my brain, I am a morning person, a real morning person. Like my day starts at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. I am useless at 3 in the afternoon. If you make me start my day at 9 and finish my day at 5, there's a pretty good chance, especially the last half of the day, you're not getting my best thinking. And how often do I really need to interact in real time with my colleagues? So when we sit and say, okay, let's start with first principles. What is the work that needs to be done? Right? What are the handoffs? What are the outputs? Who does what with which and to whom? What does the workflow look like? And then now we have the benefit of 2 years of going, we didn't think some of these jobs could be done remotely, but you know what? They're doing just fine. So maybe this job, trucks need to be loaded. Somebody needs to be in the warehouse. We can't get around that. Does the marketing team need to schlep to the office 5 days a week in order to do their work? Maybe not. And so you start getting real specific about what jobs need to be done, who needs to do them, where can those jobs be done, and do they need to be done synchronously? Does everybody need to be logged on at the same time every day in order for this to happen? And the problem is that there is no template that you can just hand a client and go, here.
Yeah.
Because it's so dependent on the work that they do. Are they a small founder run company, local, fairly small? Is it a global cooperative? Is it a bunch of creative minds, or is it a lot of exacting work that needs to be done? All those questions play into it.
Mhm.
So the best we can do, and the models in the long distance leader, especially the second edition, because we've brought in models from our other books, Long Distance Team, Long Distance Teammate. We've included those models in there. And the one that I think is most important, and if I'm going down a rabbit hole, Meredith, for heaven's sake,
No,
stop
I
me.
think this is really helpful because you're helping, I think, my listeners start evaluating what do we need to look at here
Right.
to make sure we get the best. So please go down that,
Well,
I don't
that
say it's a
particular rabbit hole?
that path. Go down that path.
Well, one of the things about hybrid work that freaks people out, and I don't blame them, right? Because it's never been done before. We're learning this on the fly. It's not like there was a model for this, 100 years ago. We're figuring it out as we go, all
Yeah.
of us. And one of the big concerns that people have that I think is more legitimate than some of the other concerns people have is, well, what about culture, right? How do we form the company that we want to be if we're not all together, if we don't see the big sign on the door and the mission statement on the wall, and we talk to each other? And how do we form a culture? Well, your culture is going to form anyway. The trick is to form it the way that you want it to be. And one of the things that people have found particularly helpful, one of the models, is when you're describing culture, the HR consultancy kind of smart aleck answer when people say, what is culture? Well, this is how we do it here. What they don't say is, what is it? What is the stuff that we do that creates culture? And we've actually broken it down into a pretty simple / simplistic model called the 3 C's. And basically, these are the 3 things that, if you really analyze them and think about it, pretty much define the culture in your organization. The first one is communication. How do we choose to communicate with each other? And that can be the tools that we use. That can be the style of communication that we use. Are we a very email heavy organization? Are we a very meeting heavy organization? Do we use webcams on a regular basis? When do we send chat messages? When do we send emails? Those sorts of things determine the kind of organization you are to a great extent. If it's all very formal communication and we don't meet very often, and that is no judgment, that's one way to run a company, right? Other companies are all about communication and in person, and that's not always the most efficient, best way to run things either, but it's a choice. So there's communication. Maybe the most important pillar is collaboration, which is, how do we work together to get the work done? And this goes back to those first principles, right? What is the work that needs to be done? What do we have to do to satisfy our customers to the greatest possible extent? And then what are the workflows, and who are in those roles, and how does the information flow? And do we need to be physically together to make that stuff happen? To give you an example, there is no more hidebound organization than CPA firms. And the leader of a top 10 CPA firm after the pandemic went to a mostly remote model, and his compatriots were aghast. How can you do that? And he said, well, think about what our work is. Except for some support staff, we have X number of highly trained, very professional people who have their book of business dealing with their customers, and they don't interact with their peers very often. So why are we paying for this big office downtown if the exact same work can be done without incurring that expense? So if you look at the collaboration and you go back to what is the work that needs to be done, and you're really honest and kind of curious about what are the best ways to do that. I mean, one thing that came out of the pandemic was, we assumed that there were like 5 jobs that could be done remotely and everything else needed to be in the office. Well, turns out not so much. Now, you can choose, you can make the decision that you want to be physically together. That's a perfectly valid decision, but it should be made based on what you really want your company to be, and not just because we've always done it that way. The third C is cohesion. How do we want to be as an organization? And this is a little mushier, but it's no less important. Some organizations are very clinical, correct. It's about getting the absolute right answer. Other organizations are much more about being collegial. So we'll come together and create an answer, and it might not be the technically best solution, but it's the one everybody can live with and we feel good about. Those are both perfectly valid approaches to your work, but added to that other stuff, it becomes a very different culture, right? If you say, we're all one big family and everybody loves everybody, but your entire sales model is built on individuals on commission beating the heck out of each other and not sharing leads and doing other stuff, it's going to be really hard to create a one team environment if you've literally set it up so that it's every person for themselves. Fun is almost mandated in some workplaces and kind of frowned on in others. Again, it's a valid decision, but it's going to dictate the culture in your company, right? And so if you look at how do we communicate, how does the work get done, what kind of company do we want to be, it starts to make some interesting decisions about things like where do we have to work and how do we work together and how does that look different perhaps than what we're doing now. I mean, it's easier to do this kind of analysis with a startup or with a small company that's just beginning. Much harder to fix the boat when it's in the water. But it doesn't mean it doesn't need to be done.
Now, those three areas I think are really essential, and I'm glad you did bring it up. I think it's very relevant to our conversation. And, you know, this challenge of thinking about how could we make this work? Our own company, we went virtual in 2011 because we had originally had software that was physical product that had to be shipped. So we needed a warehouse. We had a training classroom where people came. And once we took a lot of that online, delivered the software electronically, provided training through videos online, it was like, we don't really need this office space anymore. And so looking at it, we realized, heck, we can get just as much done working from home and with less stress. You know, that's something we haven't talked about. The commute, the stress of the commute can be a negative in terms of productivity for people dealing with traffic or whatever system of transportation they use.
I would put the caveat on this part of the conversation that we are now talking about North America.
Hmm.
And the reason I say that is that much of the world likes to go to the office, and it likes to go to the office sometimes for social things, and it likes to go to the office because there is no such thing as a spare room in a Tokyo apartment.
Yeah.
Most European cities have gone to 80% in office versus remote, where it's about 50% flexible here in the US because the commutes are shorter, people are used to public transportation, and they do their social stuff at work and then they go home.
Yeah.
So, you know, we need to remember that we're talking about North America when we're talking about long commutes and all of that. And even at that, working from home is no guarantee that you're going to get stuff done. A lot of women are doing what the reverse of what they used to do, which is they'd go to the office and then they'd work from home when they really needed to get stuff done. Now it's the other way around because there are kids and husbands and dogs and dishes, that it's easier to focus in a place where people are focused. Which is why it's so complicated and why you need to.
Well, and I think the whole thing is, like you said, there's not a boilerplate, you know, solution that you can hand to someone and say, here, do this, because the situation within any given organization requires or needs different things. I like the three questions, especially around collaboration, you know, getting the work done. How are we going to get it done? And there's a word we haven't used yet here, but I think it was important when people needed to start working remotely. And it's very important to the creating of culture, and that's trust.
Yeah.
Trusting that people are getting the work done in whatever setting they're working in. And I'd love for you to talk about that. What did you find in the early days? Where was the stress or concern around this? was it top level, mid-level managers?
Yeah, it was really interesting when we did the research. Remember, research was 2017 for a 2018 book, which is
Right.
pre-COVID. We asked managers, are you worried whether your people are working or not? And the individual manager, the individual team leader, overwhelmingly said no. We trust our people. The work is getting done. We're not worried about it. Where the worry was at the top level, where you know how those people are. The minute they're not in the office, the minute that somebody isn't standing over them, they're going to slack off. And of course, there were horror stories, people with 2 jobs and people who had effectively quit and just continued to get a paycheck. So there were enough of those horror stories that people kind of freaked out. Senior leaders were far more concerned about it. And to cut them some slack, they were concerned about it for 2 reasons. Number one is most of them had never worked remotely. For their entire careers, and senior leaders tend to be senior, for their entire careers, this is how it was done. And so they couldn't wrap their head around something they hadn't personally experienced.
Mm.
The second thing is that, when Jamie Dimon from Citibank came out and said, okay, everybody back to the office. If you don't want to go back to the office, we will continue to pay you, but you are on the job track. If you want to be on the career track, you will get your butt into the office. And all the remote work supporters lost their mind and screamed and yelled about that. But I get it. Think about a very hidebound organization like finance. For 200 years, it has been built on bringing young people in, mentoring them, building relationships, the process for success. And leaders, senior leaders, want their people to be successful, right? Someday they're going to take my job when I retire. I only know one way to develop those people. So while I am the last person to be cutting Jamie Dimon any slack about anything, I do have to acknowledge that it's not entirely hidebound dinosaur thinking to worry about these things. How do you shake it off? Well, I think what will eventually shake it off is proof of concept. As smaller companies in that field grow and are successful, a big one, as frankly, as turnover starts to build and it gets harder to recruit people to an environment like that, right? I mean, organizations say, we want the absolute world-class best talent. But what they usually mean is we want the absolute world-class best talent that lives within 20 minutes of the office. Well, those are 2 different requests.
Yeah.
Which is more important to the long-term sustained success of your organization?
Well, that's such a good point. This whole idea of recruiting and recruiting locally to find people that are willing to work in whatever hybrid setup you've created, or to be able to extend your net way outside, because you don't have requirements for people coming into the office every day. It seems like there are even some senior leader positions where people are getting recruited and they're not being required to move,
The
right?
new CEO of Starbucks does not live in Seattle.
Right. Great example.
He lives in New York City. Doesn't mean he's not going to go to Seattle. There are planes that go New York to Seattle, and heaven knows he can afford it. But there's a perfect example, right? One of the things that has happened since the pandemic is there are some interesting demographic shifts going on. Who do you think wants to be in the office the most?
You mean in a business, or I
Yeah,
mean in a geographic area or within a demographic or
demographic area?
well, young people might because they're used to socializing in person in college.
Yeah.
Would
Young
as an
people is
example.
the correct answer. The people who are embracing remote work the most and embracing flexibility the most. I'm 40. I know my job. I'm good at my job. I don't really like the commute. I'd like to spend some time with my wife and kid. I'm really digging this flexibility thing. Young people, new recruits, want to be in the office more often. And there are, I'm guessing, three, there might be more, primary reasons for this. You kind of touched on one, which is the social component. But it's not just, oh, we like to talk to other people at work. They're new to the workplace. They just got out of school. Their high school and their college friendships have dissolved. They don't have access to the support system they had before. They might be in a different part of town or an entirely different city now, and they don't know anybody. So there is some of that, to be sure. It's also, there is so much you learn in the first few years of a job about what does it mean to be a professional and how does one dress and why can I talk to my manager one way, but I have to talk to the vice president a very different way? And never mind learning about the culture of the specific organization. Well, that is best learned in social, in-person groups where you're picking up cues from each other and you have access to information when you need it. And they need to prove themselves. One of the things about remote work, for remote work to happen, is people have to do their job. And what is my job and how do I learn to do it and all of that good stuff. So young people are in a different position. They need more training. They need more socialization. What we didn't realize is how thin the veneer of civilization was in office work until we returned to the office. And I remember asking one of my clients, how's your return to office going? And she says, horrible. And I said, what do you mean horrible? And she goes, they've gone feral. They've forgotten what it means to work in close proximity to other people, to be a professional, because they had 2 years of not having to wear shirts with buttons and being able to play whatever music they want while they're working and not having to talk to Bob because you know how he is. And now I got to deal with Bob. And it's not like socially in America, anything's changed over the last 6 years or so. Yikes. But, depending on where you are, new hires probably need to spend more time in the office in close proximity to managers and mentors. As you get better at your job, I mean, if my job consists of fighting traffic, getting to the office by whatever time it is, hanging my coat over my chair, pounding on my keyboard for 8 hours, getting up, picking up my coat and leaving, why do I need to be in the office? Especially once I've learned my job and have proven that I'm good at it. And I've built the relationship so I know who to go to if I have a question, and I know the people that I can rely on and all of that. So where are you in the organization? Where are you in terms of your term with the company? All of these things play a role.
Yeah. As we've touched on numerous times, this isn't just a one solution thing. And I would love, as we're kind of wrapping up here, for you to think about going into the future.
Yeah.
What do you see ideally being an approach that will help organizations really be able to adapt on an ongoing basis
Yeah.
to the
Well,
different changes that come up.
yeah, I think that the first thing is something we told our clients coming out of COVID, and some of them listened, and a lot of them spent a lot of time, even before people came back, saying, okay, we're going to put together this policy, and this is what it's going to look like. And it just didn't match. The assumptions didn't match the reality of where people were. So one thing that we cannot stress enough is pilot before policy. Give it your best guess, right? Talk to people, come up with the best solution you can think of at this moment, and then constantly reassess. How's it going? What's working? What's not working? How do people feel about it? It's interesting. Some people couldn't wait to get back in the office, and they were back in the office for like a week and went, oh, yeah, I remember this. you know, and other people were desperately lonely, unhappy, hard to take a conference call with a kid tugging on your leg and all of that stuff. So they wanted to be back at the office, at least most of the time. And the people that you hired may not be the same as they were. As you add new people to the team, the dynamic is constantly changing, right? If you're a mostly in-office group, but the new person you really want to hire is in the next state, maybe we need to re-examine some of this. So taking the time to stop periodically and assess, and we have a bunch of assessment type questions and things in the book, and you can come to the Kevin Eikenberry group and download the resources from the book. But that's a big one. Some of the questions that we asked earlier, do you really know who does what and which jobs need to be done synchronously and which ones don't? And then do you have the tools, and are you using the right tool for the right job? And those are the things you need to think about. And then you can start to form, what is my ideal state? In a perfect world, how often would we meet as a team? How often do we have one-on-ones? When we have those one-on-ones, can we do them remotely, or should they really be face-to-face? All of those questions will inform your policy, and then you put your policy in place and know that it's likely to change as things happen, right? We saw some of what happened during COVID. We kind of predicted some of that. There were things that happened that we didn't predict. Okay. We got new data. If you are unable to change your policy in the face of new data, you're probably in trouble.
That is such an important point, and I think it's a good one to kind of wrap up with, is that flexibility, that openness to feedback, to looking at new data, and hearing what people say, and being open to trying something else. I think where folks get most unhappy and rebellious, or whatever, range of emotions you want to plug in there, is when they feel like they're not being heard. And so many of the elements of your book, touch on that, the importance of asking for feedback and then acting on it. So you're not just superficially getting input and then doing nothing with it.
Well, and again, I can't believe that I'm doing this. In defense of senior leaders and people running the company, a lot of the discussion around flexibility is coming from two different standpoints. And unless we can speak each other's language, it's not going to work. The company says, we want people back in the office, and usually the sentence ends there, right? There's no rationale for it. Well, what we want is people to feel like they're part of the company, and we want people to meet, and we want people to meet other people from other parts of the organization. And Those are all valid kind of requests. We're paying $100,000 a month for this building that nobody's in. Employees are going, that's a you problem, right? Now, the other side of that is when the employees talk about flexible work, it's almost always from their standpoint. I want more time with the family. I don't want to commute. I got used to wearing a t-shirt and bunny slippers, and putting on a tie doesn't seem great. Well, that's nice. We want happy employees, but that's not the employer's problem. Beyond you don't want them unhappy enough to quit.
Mm-hmm.
So we really need to understand, why are we doing this? A lot of people want flexibility because, again, North American problem, it's the only benefit they get. We're not getting medical. We're not getting paid leave. We're not getting. The only thing that is negotiable these days is, how much time do I have to spend in the office? So people are negotiating that. But as somebody who wants that flexibility, we didn't come up with this brainstorm in time for the book, but there's something that we call the Spider-Man paradox, which is, if you know your Spider-Man comic books, the phrase "with great power comes great responsibility" comes up a lot. Well, as workers in this new economy, in this new workplace, we've never had as much power as we have now. And especially when we're working remotely, especially when we can be flexible around hours and what time we do it. But there's a responsibility that goes with that. We need to get our work done. We need to give an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. That's the deal you make when somebody hires you, right? We need to show that even if you are not standing over me, I am getting my work done and doing it, and I will show you my work, right? I would rather you not monitor my keystrokes and, be in that ridiculous position where people now have bought mice that jiggle every minute and a half, so that their bosses tracking their computer activity think they're working. But we got a responsibility to our employers, just as, news to some of them, our employers have a responsibility to their employees. And if you don't have that discussion, and if the only discussions you have are, this is what I want, this is what I want, right? If I can negotiate, if I can prove to you that my quality of work will not go down, my attitude will be better, and I will continue to be a good teammate to my colleagues. If I can prove you that, can I work remotely? That's a valid conversation, because you're acknowledging what the company needs. And if you're giving them that, they're much more likely to have the conversation with you. And so all of this is going on amongst all the other changes that are going on around us. I mean, this country is different than it was in 2020 or 2018. The world is different. And certainly the workplace and the technology are different. So that's why the new version of the book, and that's what the heck I'm doing here.
Well, Wayne, I've so enjoyed this conversation because you've given some guidance. You've also posed a number of questions that I think are really good for folks to think about, who are in workplace environments where either they are in the senior leader role and can think through, what kind of culture do we want to create? How do the communication, collaboration, and cohesion work together to create the culture we want? And so therefore, how do we need to structure the work so it gets done? So thank you. I love this. And I really want to encourage people to pick up a copy of your book, because if they haven't read the first one, you've got a lot of the really great meat still into the second version, but you've introduced some important concepts and ideas that reinforce the world we live in today. So please share with my listeners how they can connect with you, learn more about your work, and also get a copy of your new book.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's very kind. I'm delighted that, the work resonated with you the way that it did. Bunch of stuff. First of all, to get hold of me, get me on LinkedIn. You can reach me through kevineikenberry.com. Love to connect and love to talk with any of you. I'm a bit of a curmudgeon, but I'm a social butterfly at the same time. In terms of the organization and the book, go to longdistanceworklife.com. That is the kind of catch-all site for our Long Distance Work Life podcast, but also the books in the series and some of the special offers and things that go with it. And in terms of the training and consulting and other things that we can bring to organizations, kevineikenberry.com is the best way to find us.
That's great. Thank you so much, Wayne, for being on the forefront, being a pioneer in this whole area of remote work for so many years, and now also just being so aware of the various, I'll call them traps, that people can get into, as well as the opportunities that exist to really create a workplace where people thrive based on all the different models and variables that you've mentioned in our discussion. So thank you so much for being with me today. I appreciate you and the work you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for having me and sharing my audience, or sharing your audience with me. And, it's just lovely to be in your orbit. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out the powerful tools we've created to help leaders strengthen their character and communication skills. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.